Health, Healthcare, and Disability, Part 1. Hi, we're going to start the Week 9 video. There's a Part 1 and a Part 2. Don't worry, I know it's going to get a little lengthy at time, but these are really important chapters. And so in this chapter on health, healthcare, and disability, when you're looking at this chapter, in the first part we're going to look at are the definitions of health and medicine. And as much as we know generally what these mean, the health definition has altered some over the years. However, we're going to look at those definitions, and then we're going to consider the sociological perspectives on health, medicine, for the different theorists, the functionalist, the conflict, feminist, symbolic interactionalist, and postmodern. Then we're going to look at the social factors that affect our health. Most notably, but not exclusively, will be age, sex, male or female, and which of those affect what kinds of conditions and social class, and where on the economic scale they will lie. And then lastly, we're going to touch base on disability. And what is it? How does it affect our lives? To get to a perspective on this, we're going to look at the effect of HIV and AIDS that had on the health and global populations, and why is HIV and AIDS referred to as a global and human problem. In the beginning part of your chapter, right at the very beginning, there's a section just on that issue. And because it's a slightly older text and that the data is not as current, I have posted in Week 9 Hans Rosling video on HIV with more current data and an HIV chart. And I've reposted the PowerPoint and the Gapminder from the Gapminder site, life expectancy, to give you a heads up about how it's calculated to help you in case you didn't see it in Week 3. Okay, now, so read the chapter in particular, touch base with the HIV and AIDS issue at the very beginning, watch Hans's video. There's a sorting of HIV and AIDS issues looking at the sociological factors that influence health and disease. The issues of age does affect how we are affected by health and disease and disability, sex and social class, and how functionalists and conflict theorists, symbolic interactionalists, feminists view these issues. What are some of the consequences of disability now? How does it affect people's lives in real terms? And that's what we're going to be touching on in this part on Week 9. So let's get to it, and good luck, everybody.
Okay, what we're going to start with before I get off into the definitions, we'll be looking at that first part of the chapter, as I mentioned in the Part 1 introduction, looking at the HIV and AIDS issue across the world. And you look at this, it gives you the 2009 statistics of HIV positive people in the world. Now in Week 7, I have posted a video done by Hans Rosling and a chart that they put out with the bubbles to sort of show the distribution of HIV in more current terms. Okay, so let's begin now with what are the definitions that we can look at. And when we talk about health, health is considered a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Now this is a departure from how health had been defined before, which was essentially the absence of illness. However, health, in a more positive spin on it, looks at your mental well-being, psychological, cognitive, and spiritual, your physical, which is typical what we would normally associate with wellness and health, and then looking at the social, the sort of community, cultural, the place in which you live, the people in which you associate with, as being all part of what is health. Now, if we start looking at what is medicine, it's the institutionalized system for scientific diagnosis, treatment, and the prevention of illness. Now you notice that medicine, of course, is still in the prevention or the diagnosis of, or in the absence of health, you have illness. And so it's the systemization, it's the institutionalization. We have the institution of the family, we have the institution of politics, we have the institution of government, of education, of religion, and we have the institution of healthcare, of medicine, where we have hospitals, and they have a huge impact on our lives. And the outside pressures have pressures being brought to bear on the institution itself. And so when we think in regards now to what is the health care, it's any activity that's intended to improve health. So health care, although it sounds, in terms of how it was being used, in terms of how I put it out there was kind of like the healthcare system, health care is really more about the kinds of things that we do to take care of ourselves, to improve our health, the activities, the things that we put into our body, the activities that we do to increase our health are all about what is health care. Now, when we consider also the thing that we know as preventative medicine, this is medicine that emphasizes a healthy lifestyle in order to prevent poor health before it occurs. So health care and preventative medicine can go hand in glove, if you will. Now, what we're going to do for the next few little bit here is look at the theory or theorists, if you will. We're going to touch base with functionalists, conflict and symbolic interactionalists, conflict, as I said, postmodern, and the feminist theories. And these are the ones that we're going to look at and explore in its relationship to health, healthcare, and disability. So the first one we'll start with is functionalism. And here what we are looking at, Talcott Parsons is the guy who had a big impact on the direction that functionalists took, and not exclusively, but in looking at health. And it viewed illness as a dysfunction for the individual in society. Now remember, functionalists view things as having parts, and all the parts need to work well together. So all those parts need to function well together, and change in society changes very slowly. It's a very traditional sort of view. Men and women need to hold particular roles in order for the family to work and function properly. And so when we look at illness as a dysfunction, it affects the way that individuals can carry out their roles, and it affects both the individual in the family. If a family member has an illness that's serious, then it affects the function of that family. If a lot of families have a health problem, it affects families in society, where how the family contributes to society is now negatively affected. And therefore, illness as a dysfunction affects both the individual, you and I, as well as society and how it can impact society. Many of you aren't old enough to remember the SARS event that occurred 15 years ago, but it affected societies quite significantly in terms of the amount of travel you could do, who you could associate with, whether or not you were going to be quarantined. And so it's viewed as a dysfunction. Now, another element that they bring up are these things about what we call roles. So one of the things that they've talked about is the sick role concept. And so the sick role concept is the patterns of behavior that are defined as appropriate for people who are sick. So on the left, these are people who are typically, sick. They have the symptoms of illness. They stay in bed. Whereas the one on the right, maybe not so much. We've all probably called in sick before and aren't really sick. Now, according to the functionalists, this is not fulfilling the sick role. The sick role is being legitimately ill and being able to demonstrate that and act accordingly. So now, when you look at what is the sick role, well, we can look at the characteristics for legitimacy. So what do you got to do to meet the expectations of the functionalist and the sick role? Well, one, you're not exempt. One is that you are exempt from normal social responsibilities. If you call in sick, you don't go out with your buddies and have drinks. So you're exempt from normal social responsibilities. You stay home and you get better. You're not responsible. You're not responsible for your condition. That just means that it's not self-inflicted. I got hungover is something you're responsible for. A sick person must want to get well. And 4, the sick person should seek competent help and cooperate with the health practitioner's recommendations. So if you are sick, you accept that you are. You're not expected to go to work if you're sick. You must want to get well, not necessarily to get back to work, but certainly to get well and be back on your feet again. You should seek out the appropriate help. Go see your doctor. If the doctor tells you to do this, that, and the other, you do this, that, and the other to get better. Because the physicians, number 5, are the gatekeepers. They're the people who maintain control over who gets the treatment and therefore are sick and therefore fit the sick role and who do not. And so this is the position that the functionalists take. Now, some of the critiques of this, or what seems to be the problem, is they put too much responsibility on the sick person. That in order to, be this sick person in society, you need to fulfill an awful lot of responsibilities. And that's one of the critiques. Now, if we move into looking at conflict instead, the theme in conflict is to look at the political, the economic, and the social forces that affect health and health care and the inequities that result. And so it's not singly around health specifically, but it's including the political, economic, and the social forces. Not everything's equal. And so how do we look at creating more equities in the healthcare system? So some of the issues, well, who gets funding for research? What political or economic links are affiliated with funding? An example would be the power of special interest groups. Some of the benefits can be that the gay rights organizations have lobbied and have gained more research into what is AIDS and the conflict of, or the cause of AIDS, and therefore also the solution for AIDS. AIDS research received about 10 times the funding that breast cancer did, and that's an interesting. So special interest groups can influence who gets what funding to do what sorts of research. Women and breast cancer, some of the successes as the mortality rates are due to breast cancer has even started to decline with when research has started to be delved into. So one of the things that comes into conflict is the relationship between health and wealth. The theory generally supports if you're wealthy, you're also healthy, because you can afford to pay for the additional health support and health care that you might need that others can't afford and don't get. To feminists. Now, feminists, as you remember, are related to conflict, and they look at inequities, the separation. Now, the conflict looks at the separation between the haves versus the have-nots. Feminists look at the separation between men and women. And the women in more traditional sort of view, in traditional societies, women's reproductive health has been cared for by other women, such as midwives or herbalists. And these women provide expertise and support for women's natural passages in life. Now, in more modern societies, in the late 19th century, going back, male doctors medicalized childbirth as a medical problem. The American Society for Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery defines having small breasts as a disease, termed micrometastia. Now, that's kind of ridiculous, don't you think? But in terms of how the feminists view some of the issues that affect women's health, it's the medicalization, and we'll talk about this later on, the medicalization of some conditions that are otherwise not a medical condition. It doesn't interfere with a person's ability to live their life, and yet when we medicalize it, it becomes something that needs to be cured. Okay. So part of the example around this micromastia is around examples of the social construction of women's health from a more dominant patriarchal institutions. The idea that small breasts are a disease really do more to support the medical companies that can make more money based on transplants, is the argument of the feminist perspective. Now, if you were to change that around and say that this was a matriarchal society and the focus was on, men that don't have broad enough shoulders, was viewed as somehow a disability, and that men were somehow unhealthy with not having broad shoulders, it's just as ridiculous. The difference is that our society is not matriarchal, it's patriarchal. And so some of the issues that we view as being normal may be because we accept a patriarchal society and don't view it as being somehow unequal and unfair. When we look at symbolic interactionalist, and remember, this is the only theory or theorist group that looks at the micro level of why things have meaning the way that they do. They look at the face-to-face dynamics, the way in which we communicate to one another, because from their focus, the meaning of illness, how is it not only a physical condition, but it's also socially constructed. I can remember back when I was younger, cancer really wasn't a part of the common language of people. And then when the word cancer started to come out, people wouldn't even say the word. That was so associated, the meaning of cancer was so associated with death and dying that they wouldn't even use the word. I can remember when the adjustment came and they called it, they got the big C. That the meaning associated with it. Well, now we have, I don't remember the number, but a huge number of cancers that can be cured. It's not a death sentence anymore. And that's all about the socially construction of what's important. So the example that's used in your text is about AIDS. Those suffering from the disease are more likely to be blamed because of close connection to either homosexual sex, intravenous drug use, or promiscuous heterosexual sex. But that's not the only way, and neither is that, in some respects, all the main cause or reasons. For example, an example of this illness of having AIDS then becomes a stigma. Many have been rejected by others for suffering discrimination and prejudice. The opposite example is Sister Mary and Mother Teresa of Calcutta has many centers worldwide that care for AIDS victims, and we might view her in a positive way in the work that she does, but the people who are suffering get viewed in a different way. So this is where we can introduce this social definition of health and wellness and look at this process called medicalization. Now, medicalization is about, that although illness is physical, how it is defined varies. Medicalization is the process whereby an object or a condition becomes defined by society as a physical or psychological illness. And so, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, the medications used to help with erectile dysfunction or for women, low libido, has been medicalized. It wasn't like men just started having problems with erections in the 1990s. They've been having this going on forever when you get older. It's part of what we consider to be normal aging for some time. But then it became medicalized, and therefore the companies went out of their way, or you could argue the companies medicalized it by going out of the way to find a solution to this, because men were complaining. And so we came up with our little blue pill, which enables men to carry on a successful, normal-looking sex life. But it was medicalized in order for there to be a medical solution. And then women, well, they argued, well, we have our own issues, so we medicalize those issues too. We have medicalized things that don't stay medicalized. Just as conditions can be medicalized, they can also be demedicalized. Some examples: homosexuality was at one point medicalized. You'd go in to be cured. And with so many failures in being cured, it was demedicalized and became something that you didn't go out and cure. You can still find people who will argue they can cure homosexuality. It was at one point defined as an aberration later on, as a mental disease, and then the definition has since changed. Menopause, childbirth had been medicalized, and attempts to redefine natural processes rather than as an illness. And so this has been a process that you can argue has gone on and for some time. For postmodern, what we're looking at for the most part with postmodern looks at much of health is still not really known. Chronic fatigue syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit disorder, male menopause, and some types of addictions. We don't know very much about it. And so the conflict between biology conflict between biology, biomedical, and culture, biocultural. Much of postmodern medicine focuses on the fixation of health and youth. Changing biology, well, to improve on the nature using ways to alter the body with plastic surgery, extending the life using extraordinary methods, searching for the fountain of youth, new narratives about life or youth forever. This narrative is incomplete and the evidence is opposite to the perception. So for postmodern, they view that part of how we try to explain our health is in an unrealistic terms, and that we're bound to fail. Now the last little piece here I'm going to show, this is in your textbook. It's just a brief little overview of the theories to give you a reminder of the bits and pieces. Now we're going to move into looking at some of the social factors of health. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to look at age, sex, and social class. So when we think in terms of age, 65 is the big thing. As we age, our health levels decrease, and after the age of 65, it seems to be a magic number, rates of chronic illness and mortality increase rapidly. Now, as the population ages and the boomers get older, that's a large number, and a large number of people who are actually healthier than they had been in the past. But because it's such a large number, that number of people in need, health-wise, increases as well. Some examples of the kinds of conditions and diseases that affect people over 65. Senile dementia, a term for disease such as Alzheimer's and the involvement of progressive impairment of judgment and memory. The forecast, by 2031, nearly 800,000 people will suffer from some form of dementia. Now that's a huge number. Those of you in the healthcare field can look forward to continued employment opportunities. If we look at sex, we can see that the pattern before the 20th century is that women died younger than men. People born in 2007, the life expectancy of women is now 83 years, and compared to the 78 for men. Now, what are some of the factors? Well, women engage in less risky work and less risky behavior, which could affect why they might outlive men. Genetically, at all ages, women have higher survival rates. And women use healthcare systems more than men. Men tend to avoid doctors, especially as they get older. They don't trust the system, as it were. And so there's reasons why women outlast men. Now, what's starting to happen demographically as well, as more women engage in work for longer periods of time, choosing work over family, we find that more women suffer from the same kinds of medical issues that men typically have. Heart disease as one, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, the kinds of things associated with the kinds of behaviors that men have exhibited for many years. We start to see that emerging with women. Will the differences between the sexes converge? Will this start to merge together? Some evidence is yes. Why? Well, women's work is becoming more and more like men's, as I mentioned. Work with all the stresses and the problems that go with it. Research on women's health has not equaled the research on men's health, and that's not just a feminist perspective. When medical world had investigated health issues, they looked predominantly towards men doing research on a population that was predominantly their population being studied were predominantly men over women. And so, for example, if you know what the typical response rate you're supposed to do when you have a heart attack or you start having signs of a heart attack, those are the signs for men. They're not the same symptoms that women will experience. You should Google what the differences are to see in case you are someone susceptible in the future. If you're looking for the symptoms that are typical for a heart attack and you're a woman, you might be searching for the wrong symptoms. When we look about social class, and this is a repeated pattern, we're seeing here children with lower functionally health and average household income. The lower your income, the less healthy you are. And this is found over and over and over again. People of lower class have poorer health than those who are higher class. The evidence, well, men who live in upper class areas live on average 4 to 5 more years than do men in lower class areas. Low income Canadians suffer more from high blood pressure, stomach ulcers, more than those people who are in high income areas. So when we think, well, what are some of the factors for poor health? Well, poverty. You don't eat as well, you don't nourish your body as well, your body suffers, and sometimes that comes out in different health issues and diseases. Poor food quality. There were some studies done in Toronto that found those who are in richer areas of Toronto have immediate access to better quality food in terms of in walking distance, access to gyms and health facilities and recreational facilities, than people in lower income areas that couldn't walk to good health food and good recreational facilities. The poor housing and crowding is more of an issue for people in lower income, higher rates of violence, and legacy of colonialism. This is just being treated in quite a different way. So when we think in terms of some of the issues, we have lower quality of food, higher incidence of alcohol abuse, higher incidences of smoking. In spite of the universal health care, it's often poverty which is so negative to health. Yet the longevity gap between the rich and the poor is narrowing due to the lower infant mortality rates that, as we see in most countries, we see this happening. Okay. Let's move on to disability. By definition, disability is a physical or health condition that reduces a person's ability to perform tasks that he or she would normally do at a given state in their life, and that may result in stigmatization or discrimination against the person. Now there's a problem. Less access to resources of society than other Canadians. Not being able to access certain things. Choosing where to live. My friend who's in a wheelchair knew where he would like to live, but he had to move. This was quite a few years ago, mind you, and it's changed some since. We have an Accessibility Act which guarantees that there will be accessibility for people with disabilities in all society, but that's got another 10 years before it has to be implemented. But this access, where he wanted to live, he couldn't live. He had to move to a place that had access for wheelchair in the apartment, that he could get his wheelchair under the sink so his knees could get under so he could do dishes. If you have a wheelchair and you go into a regular kitchen, a lot of things you can't access very easily because your knees bump into it or the cupboards are too high. So some of the disability oppression, the barriers that exist for people with disabilities in Canadian society. You'll find that if you were to imagine yourself in a chair, there's a lot of stores you can't maneuver around because the aisles are too small, or as the image indicates, there's too many stairs. Some of the other accessibility devices, transportation problems, employment discrimination. About 4.4 million people age 15 and over, representing about 14% of the adult Canadians, have one or more physical or mental disabilities. That's quite a large number of Canadians. The numbers have increased. And why? Well, there's an advancement in medical technology that saves many more people who would have otherwise died. And as more people live longer, they are more likely to experience diseases that disable them. So persons with severe disabilities from birth are more likely to live and live longer than they did in the past. Some other factors that can affect disability? Well, the environment we live in, both in terms of the physical environment and the social environment, our lifestyle, working conditions. In 2001, 1 out of every 8 Canadians experienced limitations due to the physical or mental conditions in which they lived. So when we look at living with disabilities, people either deny or accept it. The difficulty to work, about 25% of working age people with disabilities were in a workplace. We see that more people with disabilities are working. They're working in a variety of different things, but these things aren't equitable as of yet. There's many people with disabilities who can't work or are not working. Opportunities just aren't available. Now, when we consider the theorists and their view, well, structural functionalists view that there's a medical model and disability is a deviance or a dysfunction, and it doesn't help or serve society, aside from, and here's the only positive way that structural functionalists view it, that if there is disability, it creates employment for people to support those individuals who are disabled. And so that's a benefit, if you will, but it's a dysfunction to society. Symbolic interactionalism, they look at role ambiguity, what I'm supposed to do, and what that means is if I'm supposed to be a worker and I'm not a worker, or if I'm supposed to be a worker and I'm working but not doing everything I'm supposed to do, it's unclear, and it creates ambiguity. With lost or never gained roles, my friend who's in a chair hasn't been able to work for other people because of his limitations. He has created his own employment, and that's made some difference. But it's been a lot with the social environment and people that he's associated with. And then you look at conflict. Disabled people are members of a subordinate group, and disabled people have fewer accesses to positions of authority and power and control, and therefore are going to be disadvantaged more so in society. All right, I hope this was helpful. This has been a fairly lengthy part on part 1, but it's a good topic and it has global implications, and we'll check some of that out in part 2. All right, everybody, carry on the good work.